Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. I'm not going to speak in English, I'm going to pass to Portuguese, but you have my text on the screen. Bom dia, boa tarde, boa noite a todas e todos. Bem-vindos, bem-vindas à primeira sessão do ciclo de encontros organizados pela EuGeSta, no âmbito de um novo projeto, Gender Studies and Classical Scholarship. EuGeSta é o nome de uma rede europeia de estudos de gênero na antiguidade, criada pela latinista e professora da Universidade de Lille, Jacqueline Fabre-Serris, em 2009. A rede reúne estudiosos de diferentes áreas da antiguidade, como língua, literatura, arqueologia, economia, direito, medicina, filosofia, história da arte, da religião, estudos de recepção, etc. Todos eles têm em comum preocupações com estudos de gênero. Em 2011, foi criada a revista acadêmica com o mesmo nome, editada por Jacqueline e Judith Hallett, e que é de acesso aberto. Mais informações sobre o projeto vocês podem encontrar no site EuGeSta, que vocês têm aí na tela. Em uma nova fase da rede de pesquisa EuGeSta, foram iniciados alguns outros projetos. Um deles é o ciclo de encontros que visa divulgar publicações importantes na área de estudos de gênero e que acontecerá a cada 2 meses. A data escolhida para o primeiro encontro é hoje, 8 de março, Dia Internacional da Mulher. E é uma boa ocasião para este encontro inaugural. Feliz Dia das Mulheres para todos e todas nós. Cada sessão terá a duração de 1h20, alargando-se até 1h30, se necessário. As sessões serão gravadas e futuramente estarão disponíveis no canal do YouTube, conectado ao site do projeto EuGeSta. As sessões terão sempre essa estrutura: cerca de 5 minutos de introdução e informações gerais sobre o projeto, os palestrantes, convidados e também entrevistadores e os livros apresentados. Depois, 15 minutos para cada um dos grupos de oradores e 10 minutos para cada um dos comentadores ou respondents. Ao fim, 25 minutos de discussão geral entre palestrantes e público e com comentários que podem ser feitos por chat ou por voz. Peço que sejam breves e objetivos, por favor. Eu não serei draconiana, mas eu espero seguir o cronograma e peço, por favor, a colaboração de todos vocês. Essa é uma atividade multilingüe. O inglês será provavelmente a língua mais comum usada pelos falantes e entrevistados aqui. Mas se ele ou ela preferir falar em sua língua, como estou fazendo no momento, em francês, em espanhol, italiano, português, chinês, poderá fazê-lo. E pediremos apenas para que seja projetada uma versão do seu texto em inglês na tela. Utilizando esse formato, acreditamos que podemos estimular uma maior interação entre todos os participantes e dar visibilidade a trabalhos de diferentes partes do mundo. É importante dizer que pedimos aos entrevistadores que eles se detivessem em algum aspecto do livro ou mesmo relacionado ao assunto do livro. Não será uma análise detalhada ou uma resenha do livro, o que eles farão. Para a nossa primeira sessão, serão apresentados 2 livros recentes: The Routledge Handbook of Women and Ancient Greek Philosophy e How Women Became Poets, A Gender History of Greek Literature. Assim, nós convidamos as professoras Sara Brill e McKeen, editoras do The Routledge Handbook of Women and Ancient Greek Philosophy, que foi recentemente lançado. Sara é professora de filosofia antiga na Fairfield University e editora do Journal Epoché. E Catherine é professora de filosofia antiga no Bennington College. A segunda palestrante é Emily Hauser, autora do How Women Became Poets, A Gender History of Greek Literature, e é professora do Departamento de Estudos Clássicos e História Antiga da Universidade de Exeter, na Inglaterra. As comentadoras serão Brooke Holmes, professora de Estudos Clássicos na Princeton University, e a nossa querida Jacqueline, classicista da Universidade de Lille e coordenadora do EuGeSta. Antes de passar a palavra a elas, gostaria de agradecer pela assistência técnica a Daniela Brinatti, doutoranda em filosofia pela Universidade Federal de Minas Gerais, onde eu também trabalho, instituição pública do Brasil, e a Caio Fernando Assunção, estudante de graduação em filosofia na mesma universidade. Daniela e Caio, nesse momento, estão em programas de intercâmbio, programas esses promovidos pelo governo brasileiro do presidente Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva. E estão em universidades europeias. Por fim, gostaria de dizer que é uma honra e prazer presidir essa sessão e coorganizar esse ciclo. Muito obrigada, Jacqueline. A propósito, fiquem ligados, a próxima sessão será no dia 17 de maio, com os professores Constantinos Nicolotsos e Ivan Ferreira. Agora, então, vamos ouvir nossas primeiras palestrantes. Então, por favor, Sara e Catherine, you have the floor. Obrigada.
Thank you so much. Maria, Cecília, and thank you, Jacqueline, and the EuGeSta project for the invitation and for organizing this session. I'm so honored to be here. Greetings from Vermont, and happy International Women's Day to you all, and thank you all for your interest. It's so inspiring to see such a many people so interested in this work. I'm just going to keep my remarks very brief and just about the genesis of this project, and then Sara can come in and maybe say a bit too about that. I was invited by Routledge in summer of 2019 to edit a volume on women in ancient Greek philosophy. And at the time, I thought, well, this is an extremely valuable project and much needed. And I had a very clear sense of the why and the importance of this project, but I have to admit that I had a much less clear idea of the how and the shape that this project would take and the scope and what this might look like. Early on, I was very sort of stuck on the problem of the lack of primary sources, verified primary sources from women in Greek antiquity, explicitly doing philosophy. So that's a problem that I think I struggled with for, maybe the first year or so. Fortunately for me, luckily, the previous spring I had reconnected with Sara at a conference at Wesleyan on social justice in antiquity. And it was very serendipitous from my perspective that Sara was already doing amazing work with her work on gender and thinking about gender in Aristotle and in Plato, and co-edited volume on antiquities, on post-humanist antiquities. So I asked Sara to collaborate and co-edit with me, and I'm often reminded of Socrates's use of the Greek saying that the road becomes clearer when two go together. And so working with Sara has just been enormously rewarding. And I think there was a kind of paradoxical thing that happened, which was, very early on, we decided that we didn't want to kind of police the boundaries of philosophy according to how, philosophy is conceptualized currently, and that it was very important for us to be open and pluralistic and open-minded about what sort of, where those contributions to thinking about women in ancient Greek philosophy could come from. So Sara and I were both coming from different traditions, and that was really fruitful as well. And the paradoxical element of this was, as the project grew and became more expansive and capacious and generous, it also came into focus much more for me. Not only emphasizing how important a project like this is, but also kind of making the how seem more possible and discernible, and with all of the wonderful contributions from our authors, seeing how so much depth and could be added to that question, and how that question could be approached in, so many different fruitful ways. So I'll leave it there and ask Sara to come in, and thank you all so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Catherine, thank you so much, Cecília and Jacqueline, for the opportunity to do this. Thank you all for your presence here. I think Catherine and I would like to say just a little bit about two of the features of the volume that we hope will be of particular interest to its readers. But I did want to take just a moment also to note that as we were working on this project, and as I had the enormous honor to get to work with Catherine in putting together its focus and shape, we really felt our indebtedness to the generations of scholars before us who had worked on gender in Greek antiquity, often at great risk to the paths of their careers. So we want to acknowledge that debt, and also our debt to our unbelievably fantastic contributors who, over the course of the 4 years that it took us to put this volume together, experienced enormous changes in the conditions of their intellectual labor. We had contributors who, in that period of time, welcomed new members of their families, lost members of their families, relocated, had new jobs arise, lost old jobs, and experienced all of the things that one experiences in the course of 4 years of life while remaining dedicated to this volume. And so I'd like to especially, I think we would like especially to thank them. And then I think I'll turn the floor over to Catherine to talk a bit about some of the methodological frame of the volume, and then conclude with saying a few things about our approach to its title and to our aspirations for the volume. Does that sound right, Catherine?
Yes, that's great. I'll keep it very brief because I know that we want to have a lot of space for conversation, and that's one of the things that's so exciting about being here today. I just wanted to say a little bit. So, as I mentioned before, one of my early stumbling blocks in trying to conceptualize this problem, what this project, was this issue of the lack of extant sources, primary sources. And I feel like, in historians of ancient Greek philosophy had maybe, apart from some of the feminist readers, had taken that problem as, since we can't verify primary sources from women, we just need to sort of pass over this question of, how women may have been involved in ancient Greek philosophy. The sense of evidence isn't an evidence of absence, and I really believe that, one thing that was kept occurring to me was that, philosophy is a sort of human enterprise, and women are, must have been involved in some way in ancient Greek philosophy, however that was evolving and shaping. And as Sara and I worked on this project, what also kept emerging was concerns about epistemic justice. And epistemic justice has a long history, but, going back to, including Black feminist thinkers, Anna Julia Cooper, Patricia Hill, more recently, Patricia Hill Collins, Bell Hooks, and then some more recent work by Miranda Fricker and Christy Dotson and Jose Medina to explore this idea of epistemic justice, but the core idea is that, epistemic conditions raise ethical and questions of justice, and that how people are socially positioned matters for, questions of how people are believed, whether or not they're believed, whether or not their testimony is given weight, whether or not they're thought to have, be able to make knowledge claims, whether or not they're even able to make sense of their situation, that these raise significant questions about justice. So I mentioned that, and there's a lot to say about that, but that this, as Sara and I worked together, and as we were reading and working through the drafts from our contributors, this emerged as a theme, and I think really, for me, became a counterweight to this difficulty about, getting stuck on the difficulty about a certain kind of method that was a traditional method in the history of philosophy. But it became a real ethic, to me and to Sara, and I think for a lot of our contributors, it started to suggest that there's a real ethical imperative to develop new methodological tools to uncover the clues that we can find in the historical record about how women and other people who were positioned not as elite male citizens were engaging philosophically and engaging intellectually. So yeah, I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Catherine. I'll take our last 5 minutes just to address some of the methodological issues that arose as we were working on forming the volume. So Catherine noted that we began planning this volume with the conviction that epistemic justice should be a serious concern for contemporary readers of ancient Greek philosophy. And in grappling with the archive of ancient Greek depictions of women and of philosophy, we took a lesson from scholars like Saidiya Hartman and recognized the value of methodological pluralism in navigating the archive. So we've understood our role as editors as supporting scholarship across current academic disciplinary boundaries, supporting work that is experimental, expansive, and multivocal. In Greek antiquity, as at other historical moments, what activities counted as philosophy and philosophical were very much in dispute. We believe that pluralism as a strategy for this volume does justice to the complicated meanings of philosophy in the context of Greek antiquity and allows for new ways of understanding philosophies unfolding over time. In light of that, we're hoping that our readers will read the volume as sitting uneasily with its title, that is, as being a volume that acknowledges the contested nature of its terms, of women, of ancient Greek philosophy, and of the word handbook. I'll take a minute for each. Women. We hoped to be committed and rigorous in avoiding assuming too quickly what women, the female femininity, and so on means for the thinkers and texts under consideration in the volume. We're interested in the many and complex ways in which those designated as wives or companions or mothers and so on interacted with the structural impediments to their full participation in intellectual life. We also hope to discern the sliding of terms to designate women, girl, bride, or wife with adjectives and adverbs that indicated womanly or womanish in a derogative sense. That is, when woman is used as an insult, not only for what it tells us about this category, but also for what we can learn about ancient Greek formulations of normative and non-normative gender and responses to gender non-binarism. We were particularly interested in creating space for work that queries deeply and seriously the lenses through which bodies were seen and represented, and the manners in which social identity was enacted, policed, and managed in Greek antiquity, and for work that aims to discern the variety of ways in which gendered individuals lived with, against, in spite of, and or for the terms of social legibility by which one was determined to be seeable or invisible, addressed or dismissed. Ancient Greek philosophy. So we thought that it is important to locate the lovers of wisdom in the context of ancient Greek intellectual life, to take a nuanced approach to the complex and contingent communities of thinkers that were defined by and defined themselves in frictive engagement with other intellectual traditions and practices. We were particularly interested in who could or could not participate in intellectual labor and what and whose activities underwrote intellectual labor. We also had an aspiration for community, for sum philosophein, this word that appears twice in Aristotle, so noticeable that it appears at all, but also for its infrequency. We wanted to avoid narrow territorializing and importing disciplinary boundaries that are anachronistic or stifling to thinking, or both. We aim to be acutely cognizant of and attentive to how the politics of disciplinary authority is linked to forms of structural power now and in antiquity. And for my last minute, Handbook. Our aspiration was less for comprehensiveness than for providing a snapshot of the current state of research. We hoped in this way to offer the reader tools to determine for herself what methods are called for in investigating philosophy in Greek antiquity and its many afterlives. This has meant surveying the state of scholarly conversation around gender in Plato and Aristotle, certainly, but also looking to depictions of women as knowers in tragic and medical registers, in the testament to the lives of philosophers, and in the reception of these texts and genres by later thinkers. Again, there's a lot more to say here, but I think at this point it would be good to turn the floor over so that we have plenty of opportunity for conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sara and Catherine. Well, now, as planned, please, Emily Hauser will talk about her book, and after it, we'll have the commenters. Thank you, Emily.
Thank you so much. Let me just reiterate the thanks that have already been given to Jacqueline and Cecília for inviting us all for this conversation, and to you all for joining. It's wonderful to see so many of you there, as well as some friends and my doctoral advisor as well. So it's lovely to see a great group of people. So this is really sort of and I sort of want to, I guess, share that similar frustration and yet at the same time methodological call for how do we deal with looking at women in ancient literature, because we are dealing with immediately the kind of the problem of absence of evidence, and how we turn that into a story and we make those voices heard. So this essentially started, this project began with a very simple question, and it was a question of absence. The question was, what did Sappho call herself? What did she say in terms of the words that she used to understand who she was and what she did in a language that at that point literally had no words to talk about a woman who was also a poet? As a philologist, I've always been fascinated with words, and I've always sort of wanted to dive more into the way that words express and shape identity. And as a writer, I'm also kind of drawn to reflect on the processes through which we become an author, and especially as a woman, when that's often against the systems that have been so authoritatively male. And I use that word in a very deliberate sense. So it seemed to me that in all of the conversations that we were having about Greek poetry and Greek literature, we were missing something pretty key, that women, in fact, whose craft was words, had for centuries no words in which to describe their craft. And in fact, I'm just going to sort of begin by shocking you with some statistics, because numbers are always a good, if crude, way to get a sense of the playing field. So we know of at least 3,200 male writers in Greek, and the names of less than 100 women writers. And of those, just over half were poets, and the poetry of only 13 of them survives. So already we are starting from a tale of silencing and absence. And I'm not saying that this is unique to poetry. You're looking at a very similar case when you're thinking about prose, but it is a case of women's literature being silent and absent from the record. Now, we might take Sappho as perhaps the best case scenario for an ancient woman poet, the one who has been lauded as the 10th muse, the only one to enter the male lyric canon. She's called a poet by men twice in the entirety of Greek literature. And just to kind of give you a comparison, Homer, who is a single poet, is called a poet 7 times in one text by one man. So the scale of the difference is just kind of extraordinary. So while a word for woman poet does emerge, it's late. It's in the mid-4th century BCE that we start to get the word for woman poet and poetria emerging, which is the grammatical feminine equivalent of poietes, the word for male poet. I found it particularly interesting when I started kind of digging into this, that no extant woman poet actually uses this term for herself. And the first time that we find a word kind of applied for Sappho as woman poet, but it isn't a word that I argue is problematic, is in the late 5th century BCE. It's Herodotus who calls Sappho a musopoios, but I kind of talk in the book about how this is actually a really interesting moment of gender politics in which Herodotus takes a word that Sappho had used for herself. And I talk in the book at length about how Sappho uses the word musopolos, attendant of the muses, to kind of reclaim a female community, to think about proximity to the gods, to talk about her relationship with her daughter. And he twists it and appropriates it and kind of takes it down a level and takes away that level of muse attending and turns it into simply being a music maker. So there is a real kind of process in which these terms are being forged and responded to across history. And I sort of, as I started to, this began to take shape, I began to ask myself what a good word for a woman poet would actually be, right? If I was going to come up with one, what would I want to come up with? And this was kind of interesting timing, because as I was starting working on the book, it came out of sort of just one small chapter of my doctoral dissertation. And it was really sort of after my PhD that it started taking shape as a book of its own. And I was kind of trawling through the masses of poet words in the Thesaurus Linguae Graecae. The Académie Française came out in 2019 with an edict that in French, every male métier now had to have a feminine equivalent. And that kind of was seen in French as a step towards gender equality. It made a big splash across the media. But to me, what was so interesting about that was the way in which it pointed so starkly towards the relativity of gender equality in language. Because, of course, in English, as those of us for whom English is a native language, English by and large doesn't have grammatical gender, with the interesting exception, in fact, of some professions, author, authoress, poet, poetess being some particularly marked examples. And in English, there has been a trend towards the generic masculine in all genders as a way that is seen as equalizing. So poet and author rather than poetess and authoress. And French, of course, is doing the opposite. So how, I wanted to ask, if we're thinking about what Sappho called herself, would we want to think about how ancient Greek expressed or repressed equality through gendered grammatical mechanisms? And would women read grammatical gender differently from men? So, for instance, would it be possible that we could have men creating a feminized term of a male word, poetes, poetria, and women reading that feminization in a different way and try to come up with their own expressive feminine terms? At the same time, I also started to see connections emerging to contemporary questions around self-naming and gender. And that's in the conversation around how we self-name, how we self-express as a crucial part of our wider self-understanding and self-expression, and demonstrating how important it would be to bring these tools and these methodological concerns back into ancient Greek, and to investigate and interrogate the cultural thrust to so many ideas ideas around masculinity, around the maleness of the literary canon, as well as kind of binary and masculine gender norms. And so the hunt for a woman's search for a way in Greek to describe who they were and what they did was on. And the book began with this core. So I've already mentioned Sappho's Musopolos. I also trawled through the Delphic oracles to look at ways in which the Delphic oracle might have sort of reclaimed poetic language. And there's a really interesting oracle about Homer's mother that I talk about. An inscription by Eurydice, who defines herself with a fascinating collocation where she calls herself the mother of words, the logon meter, at the same time as kind of on the surface of the text, she's praising herself for being a mother of sons, which turned out pretty well as well because her grandson was Alexander the Great. All the way into Corinna's critiquing of the system that puts women in competition with men. So there's a famous fragment of Corinna where she blames Myrtis for competing with Pindar. And I read this as a way of kind of interrogating the tradition that sets women poets against men. To Gnosis's epigrams, where she has a fascinating moment where she talks about she puts on the mask of a male dramatist, and she then calls herself in the mask of the male dramatist a tiny nightingale of the muses. So a really interesting kind of layering of gendering there. But just kind of like the reflection of Medusa in Perseus's shield, this is also, and perhaps always, a story of more than one gender, of relationality, of intertwined stories. And in Women's Search for a Name of Their Own, I began to see a reflection of other searches, and particularly, of course, the story of men. And as I delved into the search that women were making for a vocabulary of their own, the flexibility and development of self-naming that they were producing through dialogue, I realized something that should have been self-evident, but hasn't as yet, as far as I can see, been pointed out. And that is that this was happening in male-authored texts too. The masculinity of the poet, in other words, was not inevitable. And this is something that extraordinarily previous scholars looking at poets and words for poets had simply taken as read, as if the masculinity of poetic authorship was part and parcel of being a poet, and as if the word poet did not always carry with it a very complicated and rich story of gendered navigation, creation, circumscription. So the strategies of male gendering, I realized, had been so successful as to make the masculine gender of the poet seem normal. And in fact, so normal that it was invisible. And so I realized pretty quickly that while I'd started wanting to write a book about women poets, and I think I would still stick to my guns and say that this is a book about women poets, because that is where we're going, it had to become something much bigger, which had to be a contextualization of the process of the gendering of the poet in Greek. In other words, if I wanted to understand where these women were coming from, where they were inserting themselves into, the gender norms that they were interrogating and breaking down and reframing, then I had to understand what the status quo was and what male poets were calling themselves. Now, I must say that I did not undertake this task without some trepidation. And again, to give you some numbers, the TLG throws up 23,110 results if you put in the word poietes. Fortunately, I have to say that most of those are post-Hellenistic, which is where I kind of placed my endpoint somewhat reluctantly. Otherwise, I would still be writing this book. So the first parts of the book that lead into the exploration of women poets and create the context for it cover the major texts that were responsible for girding and shaping the masculinity of the poet, and in some ways making it seem invisible. And that happens, interestingly, alongside moments of the silencing and overpowering of women who are explicitly labelled as poets or as kind of poetic instruments. So I begin, of course, with Homer, thinking about the masculinity of the Aioidos Ane, the singer man, and the way in which the singer man promotes the glories of men. I talk about the Musaon Therapon in Hesiod, the attendant of the Muses, and looking at how he sort of marks out the space of poetry as one in which only men can sing. He uses a resonant phrase, andres aioidoi, and the muses, in fact, their power is taken into and subsumed into the male poet. And I read that alongside the interesting parable of the hawk and the nightingale in the Works and Days, where the nightingale is called an aioidos, a bard, but never actually sings, and is told by the hawk that she needs to shut up because the hawk is stronger. So a very strong gendered lesson for women poets there. I move into the rape metaphor of the creation of the lyre from a disemboweled tortoise, with a very disturbing semi-rape scene in the Homeric hymn to Hermes. Aristophanes' gender bending and the kind of pushing at the edges of the gender of the poet, and then at the same time the way that is kind of brought back into mainstream masculinity. Plato's gender circumscription of the right kind of male poets and male topics. And finally, Euripides' exploration of how there might be a possibility for women to exist as aioidoi, as singers in the kind of other world, at the same time as ultimately that project kind of ends up failing and becoming trapped again in gendered stereotypes. So in sum, what I hope emerges in How Women Became Poets is a structuring of a history of the gendered creation of Greek literature. And if readers take anything away from it, what I'd like them to remember is that it was not inevitable that the poet and the author became male. They were forged that way by centuries of men writing to circumscribe the canon as male. But just because the artifice of inevitability has been constructed, let's not take it at face value. Let's remember that words are what we make them, the labels we use, and the stories we tell are the ones we choose to remember. Let's not forget that women became poets too. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emily. Well, now I pass the word to Brooke Holmes to comment Sara and Catherine books. Thank you, Brooke.
Thank you so much. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah. It's a great pleasure to have the opportunity to speak on the panel today, and I'm especially glad to have the opportunity to celebrate together with Sara and Catherine on the imminent publication of the Routledge Handbook of Women in Ancient Philosophy. I also want to thank Cecília and Jacqueline and the members of the editorial committee of EuGeSta for the invitation to speak today. The handbook is a remarkable achievement in many ways, which I think didn't fully come out even in your presentation, not least because of the size and breadth. 40 chapters that travel from the Homeric hymns to 20th century writers such as W.E.B. Du Bois, Toni Morrison, Sarah Kaufman, and Shiri Moraga. But this scope isn't only about the book's dimensions or time span. It also attests to the editor's positioning of the book as an avowedly pluralist project. And here, Sara has already read some of what I wanted to bring out, the way that that Sara and Catherine articulated their role as supporting scholarship across current academic disciplinary boundaries and work which is experimental, expansive, and multivocal, and that bears repeating. This kind of labor that is infrastructural and community building labor is often unrecognized inside and outside the academy, and for predictably gendered reasons. And even when it is recognized, it's valued in different, again, predictably gendered ways, cross-cut with race, class, nationality, and status. Women-identified folks are still quietly tasked with social reproduction as part of what it means to be feminized. The work they do is always already removed from the standard labor accounting and de-intellectualized. I therefore want to start by really acknowledging the work that Sara and Catherine have done to imagine and to realize this project as itself an enactment of an expansively feminist community. Moreover, this is precisely the kind of work, and it is the work of EuGeSta itself. And here I really want to recognize Jacqueline's work and Judith's work and the editorial committee and Cecília and Jacqueline's work in organizing this today. This kind of work speaks directly to the third time frame that Sara and Catherine name in the introduction as central to their project. So they're thinking about how women were knowers in antiquity, how they're situated as knowers in the reception of these texts, and then third, how is the contemporary reception of ancient texts influenced by contemporary gender conditions in the academy and beyond, end quote. So these contemporary gendered conditions, of course, still trouble the conjunction women in ancient philosophy. Such conditions are linked to the first time frame that Sara and Catherine named, that is how women were treated as thinkers in their own time, and this has already come up. The big problem, of course, is the ancient philosophical texts we have are by men. But by framing this problem in terms of epistemic injustice, Sara and Catherine show how this condition has been used to perpetuate a silence around questions of women and gender in the modern study of ancient philosophy, to take that silence for granted rather than to think about what it might say. In other words, I think by choosing the terms of epistemic injustice, they help draw a connection between the state of the ancient evidence and the gender dynamics of the study of ancient philosophy today. And I'm quite sure that almost everyone, I'm sure that everyone on this call who identifies as a woman or has been otherwise feminized, including by working on so-called feminine things, has not one or two, but many stories about being delegitimated from the get-go as either a scholar of ancient philosophy, as a philosopher, as frankly, as someone who just knows shit. I know that I'm used to it, and I know it doesn't matter how much I know, or more accurately, the more I know, and here I mean what I know in many different kinds of ways, the more important that it is for other people to remind me that this business of knowing is not for me. So less than a year ago, I approached a recently retired scholar of ancient philosophy at a reception and was coming up with a big smile on my face. And he said, "Hello, Brooke, are you done having children yet?" I know that it matters to know that this kind of shit happens all the time still. Knowing this is really important. So we're all still always auditioning for a claim on reason, for the right to be taken seriously. And this is why it matters that this volume exists. Because it's not just speaking to questions of the gendered conditions of the reception of ancient philosophy. It's changing the terms of that reception by making space to think with the conjunction of ancient Greek philosophy and women, understood as queer and trans inclusive, and to think too about where that conjunction might lead. Now, I emphasize this last point because Catherine and Sara themselves emphasize, and again in the introduction or the overview that they just gave now, that the very terms of their project are contested and constrained. So women, ancient Greek philosophy, and handbook. This is true that they are constrained terms, but from what I've seen of the volume, and here I've seen the introduction, I've seen the table of contents, and I'm looking forward to reading the rest, the volume also works against the constraints that those terms bring. And I think it invites us to reflect on the implications of choosing some terms instead of other terms, knowing that we're always making choices. And I think, Emily, in your presentation now, this came out too, about the choice of the terms we make. So as it's been emphasized already, the language of women brings us back to the limitations of the archive, the near total absence of women authors, and the absence of information about women's lives more generally. These absences, as Sara and Catherine underscore, are compounded by class, status, and race, and they create other patterns of absence and silence. Still, as I understand it, part of the commitment that Sara and Catherine have to epistemic justice means staying with whatever traces we have of women's epistemic agency. So looking for the sources about the participation of women in philosophical schools. But nevertheless, they see themselves and their contributors as attuned to the challenge that has been articulated by Saidiya Hartman, as Sara has already brought out. As she writes in her 2019 book, and I'll read the quote actually, "Every historian of the multitude, the dispossessed, the subaltern, and the enslaved is forced to grapple with the power and the authority of the archive and the limits it set on what can be known, whose perspective matters, and who is endowed with the gravity and authority of historical actor," end quote. So part of this project of working within the limits of the archive means finding women in part by pushing the boundaries of what counts as philosophy, both as it's construed as a professional academic discipline today that produces legitimate objects of study, and as it's understood as a self-conscious form of intellectual labor in the 5th and 4th centuries BCE. So I'm thinking here, for example, of the chapter by Chelsea Harry on Sappho in the time of Aerophilosophy. But nevertheless, the boundaries of philosophy as they're set already in Antiquity do delineate a good part of what the handbook covers. And so here we start to move by necessity towards fictionalized or semi-fictionalized female figures, most famously Diotima. And we also move towards concepts of sexual difference and ideas about women in canonized texts, especially, but not only by Plato and Aristotle, so Book 5 of the Republic or the status of the female in Aristotelian biology. Now, this domain of the category of woman is not separable from an engagement with gender more broadly. That is, on Joan Scott's terms, gender is a category of historical analysis. But it's not isomorphic with it, and I think that's worth remembering. By keeping the focus on women as a class of human beings, questions of gender stay primarily tethered to their impact on how women are sexed beings conceived of as like or unlike men or males, and especially how those similarities or differences bear on the capacities that get you personhood in the dominant ideology from the 5th century, that is autarky, who has the right to exercise reason. So what I'm trying to draw attention to here isn't the debate that was particularly important in the field of classics in the late 80s and the early 90s, where there was a debate about whether we feminists should be studying real women and by and large avoiding the canon altogether, or whether they should be pursuing questions of gender. So that debate was posed in zero-sum terms. And if people have emphasized, as Sara and Catherine have emphasized, this is not a zero-sum project. Rather, what I'm curious about is the relationship of the category of women in primarily philosophical texts to the category of gender. So the limits of the archive in terms of women as epistemic actors means that woman especially coalesces in this project as an abstracted category embedded within canonical texts where gender and embodied sexual difference converge. So I am interested actually in hearing from Sara and Catherine a bit more about what some of the broader implications were of staying with that category, given that they have, if not a bird's eye view, at least a perspective that's more synoptic and situated. So how did the choice of women as a category in relationship to questions that might have been focalized through gender shape things? And especially under conditions where woman is primarily going to be a category of personhood in canonized male philosophers, rather than a site of embodied subjectivity recovered from the historical archive. By necessity, that's the way the evidence is we have to deal with it. Again, it's not a question of choosing one approach over another. All of these ways of approaching things, looking for women in the archive, looking for the category of women in canonized texts, thinking more broadly about gender, are mutually complementary exercises. What I am bringing out is how attending theoretically and analytically to the differences between these ways of coming at sex gender in the ancient evidence is itself part of feminism's project of epistemic reparation. In other words, I see that this project is an invitation to think more about the theory, what we do together as the theorization of what it means to think about sex, gender, and other forms of difference in antiquity. So I'm just coming to a close, but I would say I'm currently teaching a class on ancient concepts of nature and human nature. So I'm thinking particularly about the intimate relationship between femininity, race, and enslavement in ancient texts that are classified not only as philosophical, but are self-consciously working with ideas of nature and natural inquiry. These are texts that are highly impacted by the division between the body, the physical body, and the soul. And it won't come as a surprise that I see the categories of body, soul, and affect as intimately implicated in the questions we ask of gender, race, and status together. Again, as Aristotle himself insisted, nature is not stingy. So the female and the slave are different categories, and we shouldn't conflate them into one another. Indeed, we don't want to eliminate the different ways in which they shed light on structures of subjugation. Nevertheless, femininity and enslavement do twine together in the specter of loss of autarky, not only in Plato and Aristotle, but in this huge tradition of thinking about natural philosophy, or what I would call a cosmoanthropology of nature. So I'll only just close by affirming my own sense that what happens at this conceptual level of gender matters deeply for the subjugation of woman-identified people, as well as those who were constitutively feminized. So just yesterday at Princeton, we had the great honor of hosting the philosopher Denise Ferreira da Silva for the Gauss Seminars in Criticism. And Ferreira da Silva's Black feminist method, what she calls poethics, is addressed to decomposing raciality as a concept that's internal to what she calls the intrastructure of the modern episteme. So her 2007 really groundbreaking book, Towards a Global Idea of Race, first undertook this project, and then most recently, she's published the Tour de Force on Payable Debt in 2022, which continues this interrogation of raciality at really the core. And so she pursues this analysis by striking at the very construction of the modern subject as transparent to itself and able to know the world. Now, for Ferreira da Silva, this is a subject primarily articulated in Kant and Hegel. I would see it as also very tied to the reception of ancient Greek philosophy. And so what I want to emphasize here, though, is not only the kind of long tail of ancient Greek philosophy in this work into modernity, but I want to really emphasize, I think, what Ferreira da Silva brings out so well, which is that it's a conceptual project. And Zakiya Iman-Jackson's work, I think, also really shows the importance of these conceptual projects that nevertheless have huge implications for highly material, real conditions. So the authorization of total violence against Black bodies and all bodies racialized into objects and not subjects, and gendered and sexed as well. So there is a very clear relationship that I think we want to think about between conceptual architectures of gender and related terms and lived harm. So from this perspective, I make this point because I think the problem of women cannot be isolated out of philosophy as it's been historically constituted as knowledge of nature and truth. Ideas about women, sexist or not sexist, are not a bug, but a feature of the system. So holding space in ancient philosophy today for anyone, woman or not, to pursue that critique at full scale feels important. And I think this book does much to hold that space and to create more space for it. And for that, I'm very grateful to Sara and to Catherine and to the contributors, and look forward to future conversations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brooke, for your remarks. Now, our Jacqueline will comment Emily's book. Thank you, Jacqueline.
Can I share my screen? Okay. Excuse me. Okay. Okay. I am very happy to be included in this first session of the cycle of meeting organized by Cecília. Thank you. And also very happy to have had the chance to read the very important book written by Emily, focusing on the word invented and used to designate the author of poetry in Greek ancient literature, has been a wonderful project, and the result is a fundamental study. Observing that no text exists to identify a woman who is the poet, Emily demonstrates how from the beginning of Greek literature, male poets as word hard to bound and define poetic term as male. The connection between masculinity, man making, and because I have to, and male agency, which came to be enshrined in the term of poetess, that will become socially and culturally so famous, result in the fact that women could never claim to be a poetess. As it is impossible to give an account of such a rich book, I will concentrate on the first parts, which explore how women authors from Sappho to Gnosis responded by developing their own vocabulary to describe their gender identity in counterpoint to the language spoken by men. In chapter 8, Emily focuses on fragment 150, in which Sappho uses the term mosopoulos. She talked about this term before. And, as it can be inferred from Herodotus' altered version, mosopoioi, that she examined in the precedent chapter, this term seems to have been read in Antiquity as a gender marker poet term. I quote this fragment in Emily's translation, for it is no right in the house of those who serve the muses, musopolon, that there should be lamentation. That would be not fitting for us. I find very attractive and relevant, the idea that Sappho formulation with its polos suffix creates a new a relationship of proximity and engaged activity, and a dynamic of care and guardianship towards the muses. Emily recalls that Maximus of Tyre suggested that the passage was addressed to Sappho's daughter, and that most scholars argued that the house spoken here is Sappho's own. She had asked, if we accept Maximus of Tyre context for the fragment, then Musopoulos here refer to Sappho's and her daughter. I'm not sure that we can infer this assumption for this very short fragment. In his dissertation, Maximus of Tyre only notes the similarity between Socrates and Sappho. Socrates chidden Xanthippe, who cries because he is going to die. Sappho does the same towards her daughter. In my opinion, the comparison between the behavior of Xanthippus and Sappho's daughter in a similar context does not imply that Sappho's daughter also was a part of the Musopoulos of Sappho's house. This plural adjective by Claude Calame could refer to Sappho and her companion, young girls performing song and dance together. Indirect testimony defines the bonds linking this girl with the poet with the term etairai and matetriai. The Suda makes indeed a distinction between the etairai, companions, and the matetriai, pupils who were poets. Even it is a seducing assumption, I'm not persuaded that the term Musopoulos set up the mother-daughter relation as a metaphor for the poet, and as we can infer from this fragment that we have here a community of female Musopoulos connected by the mother-daughter bond. However, I am convinced by the other instances of mother-daughter imagery that Emily gives in this chapter. For example, Gnosis search epigram about the fine linen clothes which Theophilus, daughter of Cleocha, wove together with Gnosis, and noble daughter, or the Delphine female oracle said to have been given to Homer. You seek your fatherland, Patrida. You have a motherland, Beatrice, not a fatherland, Patrice, the islands of Aeos. Your mother's Metros fatherland, Patrice, we should receive you when you die. As noted by Emily, the oracle make no mention of Homer's poetic identity, give him no poet term, and structure his response through the relationship between mother and child. In the following and the last chapter of her book, Emily explores the different way in which women poets have responded to the discourse surrounding the male gendering of authorship in works like Aoidos. She begins with Sappho's fragment 106, in which Sappho speaks of an Aoidos from Lesbos. Superior of the poet Aoidos from Lesbos is to those of other land. This fragment can be interpreted as oscillating between what might to be a differential knowledge of the superiority of male poetic colleagues, and on the other hand, of a subtle intimation that she should be included among the group of superior lesbian Aoidos. The Delphic oracle on male poets like Homer, Pindar, Archilochus constitute other instances that we find women talking in verse about male poets. When the female Delphic oracle addressed to male poets denies them in the same way that women are denied poet vocabulary, it is clearly challenging the male gendering of poet. After noticing that, just like Diotima, women poets seem to have been very much aware on the fact that their gender poetic identity was placed in contrast to that of men. Emily quotes a direct evidence of this, the fragment in which Corinna blames the female poet Myrtis. I blame Claire-Sundi, Ligura, Myrtis, because as a woman, Bana, she went into competition with Pindar. Here, Corinna criticized Myrtis, a 15th century BC lyric poet, suggesting that as a woman, she should not have competed with the male Pindar. Emily presaged that this is not then necessarily an evocation of a real context between the two poets. According to her, Corinna is not blaming her fellow female poet. It is a very interesting suggestion, rather ventriloquizing the male criticism of women poets and indirectly denouncing the kind of negative criticism focused on their gender to which women poets are subjected. Emily concluded, in this sense, the heresy between Myrtis and Pindar is not an actual competition, nor it is between those two poets alone. It is the poetic battles of the sexes where women, including Corinna, are judged not on her own terms, but in comparison and contrast to men. Including Corinna, I will follow up on this remark. Emily notes in passing that there is therefore a certain irony to the fact a later male author tradition imagine Corinna defeating Pindar in competition. Even though we find it in texts by male writers, this mention of a competition described as real between a female and male poet and resulting in the victory of the female poet seems to me worth considering. Of course, if it really took place, this competition implies that Corinna was a 15th century BC poet, like Mirtis, and not a 3rd century BC poet. In fact, we don't know. I quote John Anderson, nuanced conclusions, the persuasive linguistic analysis by Page and West, point to a late date, about 300. The non-linguistic material seems to be more indicative on an earlier period. The present analysis, working from the reconstruction of an Ars Poetica, also tends to suggest an earlier dating. But it is no, but means decisive. I briefly recall the various mentions of the competition. In the Gloria Atheniensis, Plutarch relates, when Pindar was still young and flaunting his eloquence, Corinna warned him that he was without the muses. Instead of composing tales, the true business of poetry, he based his work on rare words, extensive of meaning, paraphrases, melody, and rhythm, all mere embellishment. This blaming of being without the muses, Amazon, ironically resonate with the claim of personal relation with the muses advanced by male poet. In the anonymous Vita Pendarimetrica, we read, divine Corinna was an advisor for him, Pindar, regarding clear voices, words, and melodies, and it was she who first gave him a basis for tale. The adjective used is ligophoton, which is very close to the adjective ligoram used by Corinna about Mirtis. Pausanias reports that in the Gymnanus of Tanagra, there is a painting of Corinna crowing her head with a band for the victory she won over Pindar at Thebes with a lyric poet. He immediately gives two reasons for explaining this female victory. Her victory was partly due to the dialect she used, for she composed not in Doric speech, like Pindar, but in one Aeolians would understand, and partly to her bind. If one might judge for the likeness, the most beautiful woman of her time. In my opinion, whether this testimony refers to a real or imaginary event, it is important to emphasize what Theaterson argued in a paper published in EuGeSta in 2022. Corinna of Tanagra has been associated with an idea of artistic authority in Antiquity, and that it still remains a possibility that Corinna of Tanagra in the age was actually a celebrated artistic authority who could in fact lecture the great Pindar of how to compose poetry. I add that the idea that Corinna was considered as a poetic poetry is supported by the Latin reception of Corinna Poetic Fama in Ovid Amores. In a paper to be published, I argue that in this year, I argue that Ovid shows the name of a real Greek poetess, famous for having successfully competed with an illustrious male poet, Pindar, in order to replay this competition and defeat the ancient Greek poetess by replacing a name in Roman tradition with the name of his own elegiac Puella, the new Corinna, and by acquiring the fame of elegiac Tantus Poeta. In conclusion, it seems to me that this reputation of artistic superiority attributed to a woman fits and could be discussed in relation to Emily's ideas of a poetic battle of the sexes. Returning to her book, it is a very important study. It changes definitively our vision of Greek poetry by highlighting a reality hidden behind the noble words like poet, which is not universal but male-gendered in its conception and it is used. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jacqueline. Well, now I think I'll give the word to Sara and Catherine to comment Brooke's comment, and after this to Emily to comment Jacqueline, and then you open to the public, right? It's okay? So...
Which of us is going first?
I know, there's so much to
Which
say.
of us is
Catherine,
first on the...
Catherine, would you like to begin and I'll...
Yeah, I have a few thoughts, and thank you so much, Brooke. And yes, I realize we sort of didn't give the full overview of the project. And when you're in the woods, sometimes you don't see the whole project. So I feel like I'm still in the woods a bit. I want to thank for your comments, your generous comments, and I wanted to pick up on the point that you raised, which I felt was a valuable challenge, which, as I understand it, is this, why have, is there a danger in using the term woman in a way that might suggest that, reifying some sort of relationship between woman as a category, gender difference, and sex embodiment. And if I understood that comment, so I think there is this danger of reinscribing woman, and by doing that, sort of bringing back in the terms of normative gender. And I think we have to be very attentive to that. And, I very early on asked our editors at Routledge, I said, could we use gender instead? Could we have it be gender in ancient Greek philosophy? And so the boring answer is, these were the constraints. But I think the serious question is, how do we attend to gender difference as a social practice and as something that's constructed and fluid and historically and socially specific, and resist naturalizing gender as a category. I guess one of the things that I thought about in connection with the volume is that those sort of terms of normative gender are never complete, and they never completely master, and they are themselves internally, they have cracks within them, and then are internally incoherent in many ways. And I think one of the real examples of this from the volume that occurred to me is Jill Gordon's excellent piece on Plato's account of gender difference in the Timaeus. And I think one of the very nice things that Jill does is sort of expose the internal cracks to a kind of normative gender conception. So I agree that this is not a zero-sum game, and we have to keep both things in play. And we have to think about how to trouble that category of gender at the same time as these gendered terms. And I'm focusing on gender, but we can, other terms of social difference and identity are also, we would similarly think about that. We have to, do this thing of trying to do both, right? Where, we work with these terms of gender difference, and those terms of gender difference are may be normative and may seem to reinscribe normative gender, but at the same time, we need to explore how those terms are never completely stable or masterful. And, you know, again, right, we need to be attentive to real epistemic justice for real people. And so I'm very much cognizant of the sort of debt to, you know, critical classical receptions, for example, in keeping us attentive to how Greek and Roman antiquity gets recruited into the service of white supremacy and unjust practices and colonialism. And so, yeah, I think we need to keep all of those. We can't rest too easy with any of those points. Sara.
Sure. Well, so thank you, Catherine, and thank you, Brooke, for such a rich set of comments, and also for a body of work that really has helped us think through how to talk about bodies in the context of Greek antiquity. And so I want to do two things in response. One, I would like to just, if it's okay, share screen to show our table of contents. I'd hoped to do that when I was giving my comments, and I'm afraid I just got a little distracted. So give me just a second here. Can everyone see these? If I could just have a thumbs up, that would be, oh, wonderful. Awesome. Thank you. So we've got this sort of organized by parts that are largely temporally organized. And I'll just scroll through this kind of slowly. I think that part of what I found especially generative about Brooke's comments is this kind of call to theorizing women and to the meta-theoretical considerations of how we go about doing that. And one of the things that working on this volume was really helpful, I thought, in seeing is this deep, deep connection between embodiment and signification that we see in multiple genres of Greek literature and attested in multiple practices that are described in that literature. And so thinking through this question of how one lives one's body, of what it means to live a body, and what forms of body were seen as legible and what forms were seen as not legible, I think really gets at the point that Brooke is making, that to theorize the body in Greek antiquity is to find the way that the body is always implicated in theorizing. And so there are several pieces here that explicitly make that point. I think that Jill Gordon's, as Catherine pointed out, does that. Danny Lanes does that as well. EuGeSta specifically talks about the need to live one's body, or the mandate to live one's body. But that point is implicated in a number of the texts in this part 3 that are looking at Greek medical literature and Aristotle's assessment of Greek medical literature. And then this question then of what changes in terms of our conceptual vocabulary for living embodiment as we move out of the Hellenistic age into later to early receptions and then later receptions. We can really see it work in this part 3 and here part 4 with later receptions. So again, there's a lot to say here, but one of the things that I do think comes out of the wide variety of collections of work that is on display here is exactly this imbrication of theory and body that comes up as a theme throughout. And again, there's more to say there, but it'd be lovely, Brooke, if you have thoughts you want to add as well. And then also, I don't want to eat up Emily's time to respond and questions. So I'll stop here. And Brooke, if you don't mind, while you're talking, I'll just leave the table of contents up if that's okay. And I can kind of be scrolling up and down as you're speaking, if that works for people.
Thank you so much. And I'm not going to take very much time, only to say thanks to both of you. And I want to really be clear. I mean, I think the critique is not as strong as maybe it's come across. It's really a question to say, if we've had these oppositions between real women in the archive, and gender has structured the field. I was really struck by how this idea of women as a category, but in texts that are authored by men that are thinking about it as an abstract category related to gender, like what does that do to how we sort of think about all these interrelations? And it's a question, that I think we're revisiting as we want to not just think about women's voices that we can recover from the archive or traces of epistemic agency of women, but there is something to be said for when gender is intersecting with theories of sexual difference in the category of women, and how gender is operating in a more fluid way across conceptual boundaries, across bodies. And that was really the question, was to say, I thought that the way that you articulated the volume's remit is a choice. Like there's always choices. And so then we step back, there's no totalizing view. The question is then, how does that help us begin to appreciate the interaction between these aspects of the problem with sexuality as well? And so it's definitely not a critique to say when should, I don't think you're reifying the category of woman necessarily. I mean, I think some of your authors might be, but that's not you, right? Like the question is how to query that as a site within this larger conversation, and how that invites us to think about the theorization of working with these texts as feminists, as people committed to epistemic justice and social justice. So thank you.
Well, thank you. Emily, if you want to comment.
Yes, of course. I do want to make sure that we have time if the audience want to kind of make comments. Have you been seeing questions coming in the chat as well? Or I'm not entirely sure how you wanted to do that. Just wanted to make sure that I don't run us over. But I just wanted to say, well, Jacqueline, thank you so much for that really thoughtful response. And I really both appreciate your generosity in your assessment of the book, but also really take on board your comments about kind of those 2 points around, first of all, Sappho and the mother-daughter relationship, and Corinna as a competing poet with Pindar. And sort of thinking through this, I think both of those points, in a sense, get to our desire and the difficulty of our desire for an autobiography, particularly of women writers in antiquity, right? It's that desire to pin down who they actually were, who their relationships were with, what cultural milieu they were working in, and so on. And I think that particularly clings to women writers because we have so little of their work. I'm not saying that that's not something that we also see with male writers, but I was thinking through the fact that the Delphic Oracle that you mentioned to Homer mentions and focuses on his biography and his lineage as opposed to his poetic naming. And so it's not just that she is taking away the name of poet, she's also fronting his autobiography. And I wonder if that is something that it's a sort of double take on the kind of gendered processes that women might have been subjected to. So I think that's really interesting. But I think it sort of makes me think that maybe we might want to, and this is something that I would probably want to do more thinking, is how we overlap those different layers in terms of when we're looking at the stories and the narratives that are being told to us about women in antiquity. How do we overlap that interest in the autobiographical construction that is being made, and then the poetic persona that is being constructed, and the gendered poetic persona? Because with Sappho, for instance, I think that layering is really interesting and important. I think particularly sort of now, I would probably want to emphasize the multiple different ways in which that identity can be constructed, both as a mother-daughter relationship, but also as a community, as you very rightly point out, a community of song. And then with Corinna, again, that kind of overlapping layers where we, on the one hand, yes, we have the potential for a historicizing reading, but on the other hand, we can also then kind of layer it with that gendered expression and the kind of construction of the self. So how we sort of switch between and become flexible in combining those different modes in terms of kind of understanding the rounded construction of a gendered poetic identity, I think is really important. And it's one that was kind of a challenge for the book as a whole, because I really wanted it to be focused on the gendered poetic persona and not on the kind of autobiography of Sappho, the autobiography of Corinna or whatever. But at the same time, one has to acknowledge that mode is there. So I'm very appreciative for that call. And I think that that is something that I want to go away and think more about. Thank you.
Okay. I am not talking about real person when I talk about Corinna, but it is her person as a poet. Okay, it's the story of the reception of Corinna. That's interesting. I find interesting. It's not. It's not. Comment dire, important if the competition is real or not. Okay, it's not. It's what idea of Corinna was transmitted, and until Ovid. That means it is interesting to try to retrace this reception. The story of how this female poet was considered as a female, as artistic and female authority. Real or not real person, it's not a problem.
I clarify, when I'm saying autobiography, I mean the autobiographical tradition. So
it's not okay.
Okay, thank you. I don't know if someone else wants to make some question. We still have 7 minutes, but it's already an extended time. Any question by?
I think I can see someone in the chat who has said that they.
In the chat.
Yes.
Oh, sorry.
I'm sorry about this. I made the teeth surgery, but I'll try to be fast. First, thank you, everyone. I believe that my questions, there are a lot of questions, but feel free, Emily, to answer the ones that you feel comfortable to answer. I wrote them because I don't know to speak very well, so I'll put in the chat and read. In the paradoxical portrayal of women in Euripides' plays, he grants them a voice that echoes societal expectations, seemingly amplifying their perspectives. Yet, in reality, these voices often reflect the preconceived notions of a male playwright, if I understand your text correctly. How does this dual nature of representation both empower and constrain the discourse on gender issues in Antiquity? I believe that this meeting is answering this question, but I would like to hear more from you, please. And on a lighter note, is there a way for me to be friends with Euripides that I admire, but I also hurt my thoughts? Given the intriguing complexities of his perspective on gender, should I always say he's good, but he's not good? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yes, two very interesting questions. So I think that's kind of exactly the point of kind of that part of the book, is that there is this kind of tension between empowerment and constraint in the way that Euripides is exploring women. And I'm not the first to say that. It is a kind of complicated relationship, and I think it's not just Euripides. I would also say that this is sort of a thread that goes through the book, in that men are consistently obsessed with women's relationship to poetry and the kind of proximity that women have to poetry. So that kind of uneasy admiration is something that goes all the way back to Homer. So Euripides, I think, is yes, he's kind of in some senses pushing it forwards, but then at the same time kind of always delimiting it, always bringing it back. And I think that tension is something that we see in the women writers as well. So I feel like it's something that kind of is reflected on both sides, that it's like, how do you operate within the constraints that are here? And Euripides is coming up against those constraints, and his women are voicing back those constraints. So in that sense, I guess that kind of answers perhaps your second question, in that, like, I think it's possible to see all of this as a search towards an investigation of the constructed gendered persona. And Euripides is doing that work. And in a lot of ways, I think he's actually doing it in an interesting and rewarding way. And so we can dive into that and we can say, yes, I sort of want to think through these issues through Euripides. So I think that is absolutely valid. So I would say stay friends with Euripides.
Thank you very much, Emily and Romana also. Romana is a master student at my university. Well, it's already, we have already only 3 minutes, and so I think you have to finish. It's already an extended time, as I said. I would like to thank you very much. First of all, Jacqueline, for putting this project, for organizing this new time of EuGeSta. And thank you very much. And thank you very much also, Catherine, Sara, Emily, Brooks, and Jacqueline also, again, for the comments and response. And I thank also very much my students for cooperation and helping so much with the technical help. And I'd like to invite you for the next meeting, which will be on May 17, with Professor Ivan Ferreira, who organized a huge comment with a lot of Brazilian scholars, more than 1,000 pages, a catalog of women in antiquity, and also Professor Konstantinos Nikolotzis, that had organized a book on women and cinema. And we will send the information, the hour, and I hope to meet you all there in the future. And thank you again very much for this wonderful meeting that I think it will stimulate a lot the reading and rereading of authors and of classical scholarship. Thank you, goodbye, and once
Thank
again.
Thank you very much, Cecília, for your amazing organization and your student. I am very grateful.
Thank you. Well, so, abraço e até a próxima.